When someone is bad at Dark Souls, FromSoft fans are quick to tell them that they suck and need to get good. But what happens when the majority of Souls vets find themselves on the other side of their own toxicity? This is exactly what happened with Elden Ring boss design. In order to understand what I'm talking about, let's start from the beginning. When Elden Ring launched, it was praised by both critics and audiences alike for being a beautiful open-world RPG that actually had good combat mechanics. At first, it seemed like everything was perfect. The new Souls game was hard, casuals were complaining, we were telling them to get good or use spirit ashes, and all was right with the world. But then a lot of Souls vets realized something. We couldn't get good at any of these stupid bullshit bosses either. Just about every boss in the game had seemingly infinite attack combos combined with high damage, and these issues only got worse in the endgame content. A few months after the game's release, Joseph Anderson published his critique on Elden Ring where he stated how much he disliked the boss mechanics, primarily for these same reasons. Joe's critique caused a shift of negativity towards a FromSoft game the likes of which has not been seen since Matthew Matosis released his critique of Dark Souls 2. The vast majority of Souls vets didn't like Elden Ring bosses, but every individual person was too scared of the toxic fandom that they belonged to say anything. Joe's video caused these Souls players to come out of the shadows and loudly proclaim, "I don't dislike the game because I'm bad, it's just that Elden Ring bosses are unfair because they were made for spirit summons." Joseph Anderson had successfully altered public opinion to be that Elden Ring was a poorly designed game for casuals. All was well, but that all changed when the challenge runners attacked. LupineOs came out with his own video responding to Joseph Anderson, where he raised many valid arguments as to why he enjoys Elden Ring boss design. He stated that Elden Ring bosses did have a lot of openings when played optimally. Although he had some good points, I don't think I've ever been more irritated watching a YouTube video in my life than when I was watching Lupine insult Joe over and over again. After all, as any good Joseph Anderson fan knows, anytime anyone on the internet insults him, it adds 1 month until the Witcher 3 video will come out. On a more serious note, I want to explain why I disliked Lupine's condescending attitude towards Joe in his video. The way I see it, some FromSoft bosses, like in Elden Ring, aren't designed for anyone except challenge runners to fully understand. Let me explain. I view every FromSoft boss like a puzzle where you try to memorize openings, movesets, and positioning tricks to avoid all damage while regularly dealing damage. However, unlike a normal puzzle game, you can still overcome a boss without solving the puzzle completely, since you don't die in one hit. This allows players to be convinced a boss is unfair bullshit when they just never fully understood the mechanics and were still allowed to progress. This is basically what Joe did with Pontiff in Dark Souls 3. Lupine calls Joe a scrub for not learning the mechanics, but it took me 3 level 1 runs to figure out how to consistently get openings on Phase 1 Pontiff, which is a bit ridiculous. If Dark Souls 3 bosses are puzzles, Pontiff is the optional extra hard puzzle that is supposed to be out of reach for the majority of players. Elden Ring is essentially a game where every other boss is a Pontiff-sized puzzle, and Joe didn't solve a single puzzle correctly. Normally, this would be extremely embarrassing for a popular game critic, except for the fact that no one else understood these bosses either. Joe's Elden Ring critique had more misinformation in it than any other video on his entire channel, and it may have been the most positively received video he's ever released, except for the much anticipated Witcher 3 video. Clearly FromSoft messed up somewhere. If you thought this video was a defense for Elden Ring, you've been clickbaited. Sort of, not really, I'm sorry. The first half of this video will be me attacking Elden Ring for how terrible it is at teaching the player boss mechanics. And in the second half of the video, I will throw endless praise at the bosses for how amazing they are once mechanically mastered. I will do this the only way I know how, which is through another boss tier list. For every Elden Ring boss that is mechanically amazing, I decided to not use any healing items to prove that I'm not relying on hit trading to win. And this includes Malenia because I like Malenia now, for the most part. In order to understand my main issues with Elden Ring boss design, I need to explain how FromSoft's difficulty options impact player experience so much that it's almost like a whole new game. There are essentially 4 major difficulty settings. Very easy mode is with magic and summons, easy mode is with an extremely high DPS weapon that can hit trade, normal mode is an average build, and hard mode is generally a challenge run like beating the game at level 1 or without healing items or without upgrade materials, I don't know. There are a million other variances that impact difficulty like shields, rings, bloodhound step, beating the game on a dance pad, and more, but these are the major categories. People who found Elden Ring challenging when played in very easy mode seem to enjoy the boss mechanics, and people who play in easy mode had a tougher time than normal but didn't mind too much. Challenge runners were initially divided on Elden Ring until enough of them figured out how to optimize the bosses. The group of people that disliked Elden Ring bosses the most were those who enjoyed playing the game in normal mode, but the boss mechanics were so over the top that they were forced into a lower difficulty. The normal mode players reveal a glaring issue with FromSoft's design of difficulty settings, which I have never noticed before. In order to substantially adjust difficulty, a player needs to fundamentally alter the way they play the game. If I want to adjust the difficulty of a rhythm game like Osu, I can find maps with lower difficulty levels which will have less circles show up. This allows me to interact with the map's mechanics while still not being good at the game because I suck at Osu. Unfortunately, Dark Souls doesn't allow the player to edit the rhythm of a boss moveset, only every other factor. You can alter the amount of mistakes allotted during the rhythm challenge with health and healing, the amount of time you keep fighting the boss with damage, and you can even skip learning the boss moveset entirely with magic, but you cannot change the boss moveset. This means that if a player doesn't enjoy the rhythm challenge of a boss, tools and in-game options won't make them enjoy the game anymore. At one point in his video, Lupine states that if Joe didn't like the boss mechanics, he should have used more tools to make the game easier, without realizing that this wouldn't fix the problem for him. Joe wants to have fun memorizing and overcoming each rhythm challenge, not finding a way to avoid it. One solution to this problem is to introduce an easy mode that changes boss mechanics. The issue is that having different mechanical challenges related to different difficulties would add way too much development time, and an even bigger problem is that it violates the first commandment of the Dark Souls religion, which is thou shalt not covet an easy mode. This means that the only solution for a player to enjoy Elden Ring bosses is to get good. Now let me ask you a question. If a game is released where over 95% of the player base does not understand how to interact with the mechanics, is that the fault of the developer or the player? And I'm fairly confident that maybe around 95% of players didn't understand the bosses, because people who play in easy and very easy mode skip learning the bosses entirely, which is probably the majority of people who played the game, and the vast majority of comments on many videos like Joe's and mine are in agreement that the bosses were overtuned, because those are disgruntled players who tried to play in normal mode but did not enjoy it. This leaves challenge runners like Lupine and his friends as the only group of people who actually understand the boss mechanics, and this has to be far less than 5% of the player base. I'd argue it's probably less than 1%, but I'm just guessing, so I mean, who knows. Lupine opens his video by calling Joseph Anderson a scrub who makes excuses instead of getting good. Now, I thought this was a pretty stupid thing to say because that only makes sense when talking about multiplayer games. If someone complains and says that Valorant or Counter-Strike is a terrible game because the guns are inaccurate, it is the player's duty to ask people who are good how to become better rather than complain. This logic doesn't translate to single-player games. It is the responsibility of the game designer to teach the player how to play the game, and if over 90-ish% of players do not understand the game's mechanics, then they have clearly failed. In fact, Lupine's own video proves that Elden Ring didn't teach him jack. Lupine says that he didn't enjoy Elden Ring bosses on his first playthrough. It wasn't until Malenia, the hardest optional boss in the endgame, where he learned to fight Elden Ring bosses correctly.
I had to face this realization myself when fighting Malenia, even with the literal thousands of hours in multiple different From titles.
Elden Ring is already the least replayable FromSoft game, and you're saying you didn't have fun with the bosses until the very end? Doesn't that mean the game didn't teach you its mechanics? If you are the type of player who only plays through a Souls game once or twice and expects to be able to understand most boss movesets in less than 10 tries, then not only will this video not defend Elden Ring bosses, it will further prove why you dislike them. There are essentially two main reasons to dislike Elden Ring bosses. One is that they are not mechanically fun because there aren't enough openings, and the other is that they are too difficult due to their movesets and high damage. As I'll prove in this video, the first complaint is genuinely untrue for the vast majority of bosses other than maybe 1.5, but the latter issue is still completely valid to have. As previously discussed, you can't make the extremely difficult to learn and execute boss movesets any easier, because Souls games don't allow you to adjust boss movesets, so you're stuck summoning and hit trading to win. Although I said some things in my original Elden Ring critique that I now disagree with, one thing I definitely got right was the title, Hard is the New Normal. There is no normal mode where you memorize boss movesets and defeat them with minimal hit trading in a moderate amount of time. However, I did get one big thing wrong in my critique when I said that the hard mode wasn't fun due to a lack of openings. I now quite enjoy the extremely difficult boss movesets presented in Elden Ring, and I just wish that the developers were better at teaching the player how to interact with the boss mechanics. I've been throwing around the word teach a lot throughout this video without actually saying what needs to be taught to the player, so let me explain what mechanics a player needs to know in order to enjoy Elden Ring bosses. Elden Ring boss design is turn-based combat with a twist, the twist being that you have to earn your turn through posture break. This creates an amazing flow state where a player capitalizes on extremely tight openings within a boss's combo string, and then after dancing with the boss for a while, the player is rewarded with a moment of calm. It's also fun to min-max the amount of damage done during posture break by hitting them with attacks of varying lengths before and after the riposte. In order to break the boss's posture, the player needs to use fully charged heavy attacks, jumping attacks, and most weapon arts deal a similar amount of posture damage to charged heavies, maybe a little less. Every boss has 4 types of openings. There are delayed attack openings, positioning-based openings, jumping heavy openings, and obvious openings, or turn-based openings. Since a boss's posture bar is constantly being drained, the player has to take advantage of every single type of opening, or else posture break will seem impossible. Unlike Sekiro, a boss's posture regen doesn't seem to be related to HP loss, so the player has to keep up aggression throughout the whole fight to break posture. When the player reaches the first mainline boss Margit, they are supposed to get stronger in the surrounding area's dungeons to be prepared for the challenge. Becoming stronger in an action RPG game is an odd thing, since there are 2 types of strength, the power of the character's stats and the skill of the player. Elden Ring does an amazing job at allowing the player to become stronger through stats, but it is absolutely terrible at improving the skill of the player through mechanics. After watching Lupine's video, I decided to play aggressively for posture break against every dungeon boss, and they died so quickly and easily that it felt like they were normal enemies. In other words, the dungeon bosses that prepare the player for the mainline bosses are turn-based Dark Souls battles that literally are not designed to be played for posture break, since it's too easy. And this applies to every single dungeon boss I fought other than maybe Crucible Knight and the Godskin. Not only do most dungeon bosses not teach the player jack, they literally aren't designed for Elden Ring combat. But it gets worse. Not only do they teach the player nothing, Elden Ring bosses also actively hide the correct way to play from the player. They hide the posture bar so you don't really know how quickly the posture heals. They make boss damage really high so experimenting with positioning is punished heavily, and they don't tell players which attacks are jumpable. Essentially, a player has to do a bunch of trial and error to unlock the fun mode. And it gets even worse. Unlike in Sekiro, there is absolutely nothing stopping a player from memorizing a boss's most obvious openings and just playing a baiting game, which is what I did in my first video. Sekiro got around this by tying boss victory to posture break, which is constantly healing. But in Elden Ring, you always have the option of baiting out a few obvious attack openings for a boring win. When I first played Elden Ring, I was scared of the aggressive bosses, and had no incentive to be aggressive back because there is none. An alternate title to this video could be In Defense of Elden Ring Boss Design. The bosses are a lot of fun, but they give you no incentive to fight the bosses in a fun way, while actively hiding the fun from the player and doing nothing to teach you any of the mechanics. If you still believe that Dark Souls doesn't have to teach the player anything because the world's dangerous and you just need to get good, I'm just going to say that you're using the game's story as an excuse for bad game design. There's a reason why Joseph Anderson's video was met with overwhelming praise from Souls vets. When over 90% of people don't know how to interact with the boss mechanics, that's probably a good sign it's the developer's fault rather than the player's. It also doesn't help that Elden Ring floods players with items while doing nothing to teach any boss mechanics, since most players will logically assume that the game is teaching them to lower the difficulty level rather than overcome it. So how do we fix Elden Ring bosses? The way I see it, FromSoft needs to do 3 things. Teach the player boss mechanics, not hide information from the player, and give an incentive for players to be aggressive. Although I've been harsh on Elden Ring for not teaching boss mechanics, I will admit that it's almost impossible to teach any mechanics within Elden Ring's open world. All dungeons are optional and hidden, so it would be impossible to know if a player was able to learn a mechanic or not. My best solution would be a training gauntlet of bosses fought at the Round Table Hold, since almost every player will explore the hub world eventually. Basically, Ofnir would tell the player in Elden Ring speak that if they want to outskill bosses as a master of the blade, rather than defeat them with an overpowered build, then they should try out the Round Table Gauntlet. Then the doors at the bottom of the large room in the Round Table Hold would become unlocked as an optional teaching exercise. Every one of these bosses will only be killable through posture break, and have posture visible to incentivize the playstyle. Each fight will take a single mechanic from a remembrance boss and force players to train this one skill. Then after training each individual mechanic, you put them all together, add a few more flashy attacks, and now you're fighting Margit, or Morgott, or Hoarah, or Maliketh, and so on. One example training boss could have a few variations of Margit's long wind-up attacks that are combined with Maliketh's Ball of Death. This will teach the player how to capitalize on positioning-based openings through circling the boss to get a charged heavy in. There could be another boss with infinite stamina, high turn speed, and some long and medium delays. This will force the player to hit the boss during wind-up attacks, since that will be the only available opening. Then when the mainline bosses do wind-up attacks, the player will realize that some of them are openings. Next, we need to fix all the hidden information. Firstly, every single boss posture bar should be visible, or at least there should be an option to make the bars visible. This may be the single best solution to making these bosses more fun, since having a visible posture bar would be a clear and constant reminder to play aggressively. It would also show how much posture damage charged and jumping attacks do to further incentivize the playstyle. Another thing that shouldn't be hidden are jumpable attacks. Now on some bosses like Malenia, where a very large amount of attacks are jumpable, this may cause clutter on the screen, but honestly I'd prefer it if Elden Ring took out some jumpable attacks, if it meant the ones we did have were better communicated like in Sekiro. Finally, we need to give the player incentive to be aggressive. Joe would want the player to either regain stamina or reverse damage back at the boss with every hit, similar to Sekiro's deflect mechanic. But I believe Elden Ring bosses are loads of fun as is and do not need a mechanical overhaul. This is for 3 reasons. Most bosses have tons of openings when optimized, the player is given a ton of stamina from level 1, and you're able to regain stamina with every posture break. One tool Lupine mentioned that could improve Elden Ring would be the revive mechanic from Sekiro. If there is a Shadows Die Twice mechanic, then doing trial and error to memorize positioning requirements would be less frustrating, and the high damage in the endgame would feel more fair. This would allow the player to play aggressively and risky while lessening the punishment, like in Sekiro. An alternative solution is to just lower all damage a lot, but I kind of like Sekiro's idea of keeping the player close to death while giving them an extra life, so I'd prefer the revival mechanic. The revival mechanic would also make it feel less frustrating when you die to a delayed attack. This is because many delayed attacks come out so fast that they're beyond human reaction time, so the only way to learn all of the dodge roll timings is through trial and error. In a game with so much trial and error, a revival mechanic would go a long way. Of course, there is still one giant issue with Elden Ring bosses, which is that nothing is stopping the player from only memorizing a couple of obvious openings and doing nothing more. This problem is made even worse since playing aggressive causes bosses to land difficult to dodge combos, which makes it feel like the game is encouraging the player to just play passive and bait out a few openings. The way I see it, there's only one good solution to this problem, which is to make melee weapons deal very little damage while making critical attacks deal way more damage. This would essentially make the game like Sekiro, where you have to land death blows to win. In order for this change to not hurt build variety, ranged weapons would have to deal way more damage than melee weapons. Of course, if every other solution mentioned in this section was implemented, you might not have to further incentivize players into being aggressive, since the most fun way to play would already be communicated to the player. I'd still prefer it if slowly banning out 2 or 3 openings to win wasn't an option at all, since most boss openings are so hard to find that people like Joe and I wrongly assumed that baiting out a couple of openings was actually the correct way the developers intended us to play, resulting in a terrible experience. Before moving on, I just want to give input on one of Joe's complaints about the bosses. He said he disliked how you can't safely attack bosses from neutral as often as you could in past titles. Now, if you feel this way, that is fine, but I think it's a non-issue since if you walk up touching distance to a boss, they will always initiate a long combo chain that will almost always have many openings within it, so you can just keep up posture damage. You really don't need to attack from neutral to always stay in a flow state, so the player doesn't need the ability to cancel attacks like in Sekiro. If you've made it this far into the video, you might feel tricked, bamboozled even. I titled the video In Defense of Elden Ring Boss Design, and then proceeded to point out every problem with Elden Ring boss design. Now it's time for me to actually start defending these bosses. Of course, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that every boss is a banger, but the vast majority of them are mechanically enjoyable, or at the very least not bad. To prove this point, I'm going to reevaluate the mechanics of every boss I once disliked using new strategies, and then place them in a tier list. I'll also try to give some tricks and tips on how to deal with certain attacks, and I might even defend Waterfall Dance or something crazy like that, so stay tuned folks. I won't be using healing items or a strong weapon to prove that I'm not relying on hit trading to win, although I did heal when fighting a couple bosses that I didn't find fun enough to defend. Now it's time to begin the defense of Elden Ring bosses by complaining about how Margit is a terrible first remembrance boss. I've heard some challenge runners actually tell me that Margit is great at teaching the game's mechanics, and they're wrong. He's awful at teaching boss mechanics. The goal of Margit's design is to teach players to circle him to land hits during his attacks. They do this by having him input read combo extenders if you attack his face, so you need to circle to his back to get a hit in. Also, his tail swipe is an opening for a jumping heavy, which further encourages circling to his back as the correct strategy. So why do I think Margit is an absolutely awful tutorial boss? Well, the entire strategy to fight Margit is about circling to his back, and the developers put him in the worst arena possible for a positioning-based boss. Posture damage is constantly depleting, so I have to play aggressive, and then Margit dashes right next to the cliffside, which means that I can't circle to his back without risking death by gravity. The fix for this is easy, just have the player fight Margit in a flat arena similar to where you fight his copy Morgott. I also think that Margit's Phase 2 combos are unreasonably difficult to dodge for the first boss. This makes many players like myself think that Margit is teaching them to play extremely passive rather than aggressive for posture break. Of course, I'm not ranking bosses based on how well they teach mechanics to the player since the entire game is bad at that, so I'll stick him in A tier. I just complained the whole time and then did that. I enjoy using positioning strats to weave in charged heavies while baiting out tail swipes, and his mechanics are so fun that I always look forward to fighting him again on repeat playthroughs. Next up is Godrick, or more specifically, the wind attack that Godrick does that people find unfair because the damage comes out so quickly. If the attack was unfair, it wouldn't matter because it does so little damage, but it's also not unfair at all. The attack just forces the player to always reposition back to mid-range after getting a few hits in, which, as Lupine mentions, is where Godrick's kit shines. If you reposition to mid-range and he doesn't do the tornado, then you're still so close that you can immediately re-engage for another opening, so preemptively rolling backwards from the attack doesn't slow down gameplay that much. I wasn't going to rank Godrick since this tier list is for controversial bosses, but since we're here, I'll just throw him in B tier. He's a mechanically simple and fun boss that maybe should have appeared before Margit. Heading back to controversial bosses, it's time to examine Radahn. I decided to use healing items since I've always known how to fight Radahn correctly and just never liked it all that much. Radahn is an aesthetically cool boss with mid mechanics. He does giant attack combos where you memorize where to stand underneath him during the combos to deal damage while not taking any damage. You learn how to do this through trial and error, but it's so easy to execute once learned that I don't find much enjoyment. If FromSoft zoomed out the camera, it may be easier to figure out where to stand underneath him to avoid damage, but that wouldn't make executing the boss mechanics any more fun, so my opinion probably wouldn't change. Of course, the worst part of the boss is probably just running to him in the beginning. It's just so damn boring. Overall, Radahn is mechanically mid, so I want to put him in C tier, but his presentation is amazing, so I'll compromise at B tier. The next boss is one of my new favorites, Morgott the Omen King. This boss basically removes everything I disliked about Margit while making the good parts better and more difficult. My two main issues with Margit was the stupid arena and how he would spam dash away. Morgott fixes the arena by making it a simple ring with ledges, and when Morgott dashes away you can roll to him, which causes him to do a delayed attack, which is an opening. Similar to Margit, you can circle to his back to bait out tail swings that are jumping heavy openings. Morgott has everything I want from a boss. He rewards aggression, has plenty of openings with many varied attacks, and has a fun positioning-based strategy to get extra hits in. S tier. Morgott is where I finally understood what Elden Ring boss design is when optimized. It's Sekiro with stamina and a ton of positioning requirements. So basically it's Sekiro but even harder. Although the bosses may require a lot of trial and error to memorize all the difficult to find openings and positioning requirements, once everything clicks and I'm able to stand toe to toe with a godlike boss, I enter a flow state unlike any other game. It almost feels like I'm flying. I completely understand if you dislike Elden Ring bosses after watching this video due to their high damage combined with the trial and error deaths, but in the end, I find that it's all worth it because of how fun the boss flow state can be when mastered. Another boss with a fun flow state is Commander Niall. Some of his main mechanics are to either dash towards you and do a weapon art, or do a storm kick, which he usually follows up with a poke combo. My best strategy is to roll behind him, trigger his poke combo, and then get a charged heavy positioning opening during the end of the combo. This boss has a lot of medium to late attacks that you can punish with rolling stabs and light attacks. Since Niall's weapon art only occurs after specific other attacks, it always feels predictable and fair. Although Niall's mechanics are fun, I do really dislike fighting the two knights to access the boss. They do this stupid hyper armor weapon art, so I have to play extra passive with hit and run tactics just to fight the boss, which I find annoying. Overall, I'm gonna place Niall at the top of B tier. Fire Giant is up next. This boss gives the player one of two options. Either you fight him on foot, using the horse to catch up to him when he rolls away, or you can fight him on horseback the whole time, but you can get one shot. Option 1 is unbearably boring, as you have to slowly run after Fire Giant's feet that keep moving around, only to do one speck of damage when you reach him. This is made even worse, since you have to wrestle with the camera to see what he's doing while trying to attack his feet. Anyways, I lacked the patience to beat Fire Giant on foot, so instead I opted to always be on horseback to land hits more frequently. My main strategy in Phase 2 is to get behind his back since his attacks usually can't reach there. I hit him, he rolls sideways, then I follow and repeat the process. It's an easy way to kill this health sponge of a boss, F tier. Now it's time to make myself look really bad by saying that Godskin Duo, the most hated boss in the game, is better than Fire Giant. Okay, hear me out before dislike bombing the video. I don't like Godskin Duo. I just don't dislike them as much as other people. And if Posture Break was visible as it totally should be, I think many more people wouldn't hate the boss. The 1v2 against both Godskin is absolutely awful, I'm not denying that. I did use healing items on this boss because it's really hard to do the 1v2 without hit trading. The bosses tend to stick together, which causes their attacks to sync up way too much. This forces the player to wait long periods of time to get safe openings. However, the Godskin have one large weakness: Posture Break, like every other boss. 2 weapon arts in a row is enough to break a Godskin's entire posture bar. You shouldn't have to hit a Godskin more than 4 times to break its posture, usually 3 times. The Godskin also enter a long vulnerable state to revive the other boss, which you can posture break them out of to keep the fight as a 1v1. The 1v2 Godskin Duo fight is completely awful, but if you are not able to keep the fight as a series of 1v1s after the initial 1v2, it's your own fault for not playing Posture Break correctly. Anyways, I'm going to give this boss C tier. If Posture Break was visible, it might be B tier, but I guess we can only have nice things in Sekiro. The next boss is Beast Clergyman and Maliketh. I used to think that Beast Clergyman was one of the worst bosses in the game, but I was wrong. Although this boss has what appears to be an instant damage attack, not only does he do this attack predictably after specific other attacks, but also, as Lupine mentioned in his video, he holds his arm out in the air as a warning before unleashing the attack. It's odd how this attack warning seems so obvious to me now, when I used to be convinced like Joe that this damage was coming out instantly. Beast Clergyman's main openings are his rock sling and boulder toss. This creates a fun push-pull rhythm, where you get pushed away from his sword swipes but then have to re-engage immediately to punish his ranged attack follow-ups. And the closer you are to Beast Clergyman as he starts his ranged attacks, the longer the attack window and the more posture damage you can get in. He has plenty of other openings, like with his ground attacks that you jump, which makes him a very fun fight. I also quite like Maliketh. I don't know if this is a hot take, but I kind of like it when he takes off to the skies. If Joe is watching this video, this is when he clicks off. Knowing that Maliketh can take off at any time makes it feel more intense when trying to capitalize on every possible opening while he's grounded. Maliketh has a lot of positioning-based openings, which I've always found fun to pull off, even when I was an Elden Ring hater. Whenever he does his overhead strike, you can circle right for a hit, and he'll follow up with a ball of death where you just need to dodge his sword swing forward right and then position out of the ball, which results in a second opening. While the mechanics of Maliketh's Ball of Death are fun, this does lead to my first issue with the boss, the damage. Although damage is usually high in Elden Ring, a boss that shrinks max HP and applies burn, on top of having ridiculous damage values, is just obnoxious. The Ball of Death is basically a one-shot, and a lot of his other attacks seem overtuned. My second issue with the boss is his rare chance anime attack, where Maliketh just executes me here. I'm certain I could learn how to avoid this attack with some practice, but it happens so infrequently that I'm not allowed to practice, and the damage is way too high. I want to put these bosses into S tier, but damn it, Maliketh is so clearly overtuned that I'm gonna have to place them at the top of A tier. Godfrey is an amazing boss. You can respond with a jumping heavy attack to every one of Godfrey's ground kicks, and when combined with plenty of other guaranteed charge heavy openings, this boss has an amazing flow. I will say that the jumping heavy timing is pretty tight, since if you jump too late you won't be able to dodge the follow-up attack. Once you get used to it though, the fight flows amazingly well. Hoarah Loux is also a lot of fun. When he does his giant hand slap combos, you just need to roll around to his back to get hits in, and whenever he goes for a grab, it's an opportunity for an attack. I also like how both phases of the boss start doing AoE attacks around the halfway point, since that further increases the intensity of combat. Although I like the flow of fighting Godfrey a little bit more than Hoarah Loux, I think they both deserve S tier. Radagon is a great boss with a metric ton of openings when played optimally, which should come as no surprise. The main issue Joe and others had with Radagon was how he will teleport spam some of the time when near death. Joe said this was an unfair attack that forced him into hit trading, which is untrue. Radagon does a delayed teleport, so you need to do a delayed roll. It's not too complicated. The only thing to keep in mind is that you can't do as many fully charged heavy attacks when Radagon is below half health because of his teleport, but there are still some guaranteed charged heavy openings, so I don't find it too annoying. I will admit that the teleport is a little bit crap, since it's a tricky attack that only occurs right before Radagon dies to cuck you out of an Elden Beast attempt, but mechanically speaking, it is fair. Overall, Radagon is a great S tier fight, but as you all know, Elden Beast is a crap final boss. I believe the star has been patched to disappear quicker and is less annoying, but having to run across a giant arena chasing an oversized amoeba cell is an anticlimactic end to an otherwise great roster of boss battles. This is made even worse, since unlike Joe, I actually do care a good amount about the story of most FromSoft games, and Elden Beast is so bad that he actually ruined the plot for me. I'm not joking. The most emotionally charged scene of any Souls game is the final encounter. A good example that I'm going to spoil right now is the ending of Dark Souls 1. In Dark Souls 1, we hear legends about the King of the Gods Gwyn, a legendary warrior we prepare the entire game to someday surpass, only to realize at the end that he is a weak shell of his former self, no longer a king, but a slave to the fire. And then the music kicks in, and it's just so great. The only time FromSoft games ever give me goosebumps is in these final epic moments, with the ending of Dark Souls 1 and Sekiro being some of my favorite scenes in gaming. So let's look at how the final moments of Elden Ring connect to its story. We fight some of FromSoft's most mechanically difficult bosses ever, while being constantly reminded that there is one god above all others in the land. The blacksmith keeps talking about how he needs to craft a weapon capable of slaying a god, building up more anticipation. We stare out at the Erd Tree, knowing that within it slumbers a divine entity above all others, only for it to be this stupid blob that keeps running away. FromSoft should have just made a super difficult Phase 2 Radagon to send off the game on a bang, but instead we get the largest anti-climax in the Souls series. Elden Beast is F tier. I will never understand how the worst boss in the game was used for the ending. There are only 2 optional bosses left to rank, and the next one is a personal favorite of mine, Mohg, Lord of Blood. Joe disliked Mohg because he is able to land 3 guaranteed hits with Niall, I think is how you say it, between Phase 1 and 2, but I actually think this makes the boss better. In fact, I don't mind Niall so much that I got hitless on Mohg with the exception of getting hit by Niall. The reason I like Niall is because Mohg's mechanic of lighting parts of the floor on fire is only tense if you can't just tank through all of the fire. The less health I have, the more fun Mohg is, since I have to dynamically figure out which direction to roll based on the position of the fire around me. Mohg is basically like Quelaag if she was actually difficult, which I love. Another reason why I like Niall is because the player is given 3 free openings during Mohg's ritual countdown attack, which compensates for the loss of 3 heals. And we're losing 3 heals out of a total of 15 if you include all of the flasks. So taking 3 away really isn't a big deal since that's already way too much. Phase 1 Mohg is a simple duel, but the real fun starts in Phase 2. He starts throwing around blood fire with every trident swing, and adds cool explosion attacks to the end of some combos that test your quick thinking skills on where to reposition to avoid the explosion and all the damage on the ground. The only thing I dislike about Mohg is how in Phase 1 he can throw fire at his feet and then do his ritual countdown attack, which is supposed to be a free opening, but he's standing on fire, so f*** me, right? Outside of this one issue, Mohg is perfect, one of my favorite bosses in any FromSoft game ever, including Sekiro. Mohg is more than S tier, he's double S tier, better than all the rest. It's time. The moment you've all been waiting for. It's time I rank the hardest, most difficult boss in any FromSoft game ever. It's time to fight
Sir Gideon Othniel, the all-knowing!
My fellow, you fought well until now. My fellow, my fellow, my fellow, my fellow, my fellow. You fought well until now.
Oh yeah, and Malenia is pretty hard too. Where do I even begin with this boss? Malenia could have been the best boss in the game, and possibly the greatest boss in the entire series, but she was ruined. So let's begin with the good. Phase 1 Malenia is possibly the greatest, most mechanically complex boss FromSoft has ever produced. Malenia has tons of safe openings. Her most common opening is when you run away from her first attack in the combo as she hooks the air, which I punish with a jumping heavy. She will also jump to the player's position with a 3-attack combo where you need to roll sideways, and if her 4th attack is extra delayed, that's another opening. She has plenty more openings than just these, but the important thing is that all of these openings result in Malenia getting staggered. Remember that. If you have been fighting every boss for posture break up until now, Malenia will make much more sense. When playing for posture break, you very regularly go for 2 light attacks like in Dark Souls 3, and instead go for charged heavies or weapon arts during longer openings, since that builds posture break. Whenever you stagger Malenia during her many openings with a single hit and then preemptively start running backwards, then you will be able to dodge Waterfowl Dance 100% of the time, unless your back is against the wall but then you just positioned wrong when you got your opening. After Malenia uses Waterfowl Dance, you are free to attack her twice during her openings until after 25-ish seconds where you need to go back to playing passive for only 1 hit during each opening. What I've noticed playing this way is that the more passive I play, the less likely Malenia is to use Waterfowl Dance in the first place, meaning that I never attack from neutral and always run away after getting one hit in. This led to many victories where I only saw Waterfowl Dance come out once or twice in Phase 1 despite my low DPS. When played correctly, Waterfowl Dance isn't broken, it's genius, and Malenia has so many openings that I can consistently get 3 to 4 posture breaks every attempt. The only real issue with my strategy is that Malenia can do a quick attack while I am running away in fear of Waterfowl Dance that forces me to let go of the run button and then roll incredibly fast. I like the challenge of this, but if you think it sounds too hard, you can always just choose to use healing items unlike me, and then tank the hit, since that is far preferable to tanking Waterfowl Dance. I think that Malenia is a double S tier fight, up there with Mohg Lord of Blood, is what I want to say, but Phase 2 ruins it. Phase 1 is a delicate balance between aggression and passivity, with a rare difficult attack thrown in to spice it all up, while in Phase 2 Malenia can just spam her ultimate abilities whenever she damn well pleases. During one attempt, Malenia literally did 4 Waterfowl Dances in a row, each one having a 24 to 28 second cooldown, and she did a 7-second Phantom Spirits move in between 2 of the Waterfowl Dances, which meant I had no openings. What the actual hell? Phase 2 Malenia also takes out some openings from Phase 1, but the worst part is how they took out the aggression-based Waterfowl trigger for it to be completely random. Now I know why they did this. Malenia is supposed to transcend in power from being a warrior to being a goddess, since that reinforces her placement as the strongest being in the lands between. Although her mechanics do match her lore, it did come at the cost of ruining the most mechanically intricate boss in the game. It isn't fun when Malenia can do 3 or 4 Waterfowl Dances in a row, plus a Phantom Spirits, as I'm forced to just run away and watch her posture damage recover to full. Unlike every other boss in the game, you aren't allowed to dominate Phase 2 Malenia, because you aren't supposed to be able to. She's a god. Well, not technically. Technically, Elden Beast is a god, but let's just pretend that that's not true. The point of this video was to disprove the claim that Joe and I made about Elden Ring bosses never having openings. But for Phase 2 Malenia and Elden Beast, this claim still holds true. If Malenia's Phase 2 special attacks were based in player aggression like in Phase 1, then it might be my favorite boss in the entire game, and maybe the entire series. But as it currently stands, Malenia is so overtuned that it sort of ruins the fight. I'm going to place her at the top of A tier. I still love fighting Malenia, but the randomness of Phase 2 Waterfowl sullies an otherwise amazing experience. Also, I chose to not learn how to dodge Malenia's Waterfowl Dance up close, because I prefer figuring out boss mechanics on my own, and if I'm required to look up dodge roll and positioning strategies on the internet to dodge an attack, then these games are probably getting too difficult for me. I also really enjoyed my strategy of constantly repositioning to mid-range to avoid the attack, because this is a mechanic carried over from Manus, which is probably my favorite boss in the series, and I just enjoy always being afraid of an ultimate attack, I guess. I don't think dodging Waterfowl up close would make me like Phase 2 any more than I already do, since this wouldn't fix the main issue that Malenia can spam her ultimate abilities while healing her posture damage, and the player can't do a thing about it. Before moving on, I just want to mention why I don't dislike Phase 2 Malenia's input read. Basically, she jumps into the air, giving the player time to regain stamina, and then you have to roll forward diagonal to get behind her for a charged heavy. Sometimes this is beneficial, as you can trigger the attack with a light attack, and receive a larger attack window for the charged heavy.
Now, if the game was built around this type of thing, I would be quite happy with this kind of interaction. Just like enemies having input reading powers to always throw a projectile when you heal, it would be fun to have a battle of wits where you can react to their reaction, and they could cycle it forward with another reaction until eventually one of you loses and damage is dealt.
Joe said that he didn't understand how the developers who made Sekiro could craft a roster of bosses so much worse in their most anticipated release ever. And I'm here to say that the Sekiro design philosophy is alive and well in Elden Ring. The only issue is that they were terrible at teaching and incentivizing the player to interact with boss mechanics. I hope through this video that I can convince some of you Dark Souls masochists that gave up on Elden Ring to try it again and refight the bosses with new strategies so that you can get all of the enjoyment possible out of this beautiful game. As you can see, the vast majority of mainline bosses I used to hold contempt for, I now see as A or S tier fights, which is basically scientific proof that Elden Ring bosses are goated. When the DLC comes out, try to fight the bosses with this new mindset of locating every possible opening to overpower the boss through posture break, rather than playing passively for a few obvious openings or hit trading. Elden Ring bosses have an absolutely amazing flow to them when mastered that rivals the likes of Dark Souls 3 and Sekiro, so give it another try.
Your strength, extraordinary. The Mohg